Your sleep is being interrupted at precisely engineered intervals, and the 3 a.m. wake-up is not a glitch in your biology. If you have ever jolted awake between 2:30 a.m. and 3:30 a.m., you will sudden clarity or inexplicable alertness. You have experienced a deliberate system access point. In this video, you will discover why this specific hour functions as a consciousness gateway, what is actually monitoring your awareness during these interruptions, and the 3 signature patterns that reveal you are not waking up by accident. Near the end, I will show you the recognition framework that changes what these interruptions can extract from you. The first sign is the quality of the awakening itself. You do not drift into wakefulness like a normal sleep cycle transition. One moment you are unconscious, the next you are fully alert with no grogginess, no gradual awareness building, just an immediate switch from off to on. Your heart rate is often elevated. Your mind is unusually clear. And here is the critical detail most people dismiss. You frequently wake facing a specific direction, or with your eyes opening to a particular point in the room, as if something positioned your attention before consciousness returned. The second sign is the thought that arrives with you. It is not a continuation of a dream. It is not your usual morning mental drift. It is a fully formed concern, often about something you have no power to resolve at 3 a.m. A work situation, a relationship tension, a financial worry, a health anxiety. The thought is vivid, urgent, and feels like it was placed in your awareness, rather than generated by it. This is the hook. This is what keeps you engaged while the actual process runs in the background. There is a fourth sign many people experience, but rarely connect to the others. Physical sensations that do not match typical sleep disruption. A sudden temperature shift where you feel intensely cold or unusually warm despite unchanged room conditions. A pressure sensation on your chest or around your head, not painful but distinctly present. Tingling in your extremities, or a vibrating feeling through your body. Conventionally, medicine attributes these to hypnagogic hallucinations or sleep paralysis after effects, but the pattern is too consistent. These sensations appear specifically during the 3 a.m. window. They are accompanied by heightened awareness, and they often precede or follow the intrusive thought. In energetic models, these physical markers indicate frequency adjustment. Something is modulating your biofield, and your nervous system registers the shift. The third sign is what happens when you check the time. It is almost never 3:15 a.m. or 2:50 a.m. It is 3 o'clock a.m., 3:03 a.m., 3:11 a.m., or 3:33 a.m. Precise numbers, repeating digits. The probability of consistently waking at exact intervals is statistically improbable unless something is calibrating the interrupt. You are not waking randomly. You are waking on schedule. But here is the part nobody accounts for. The 3 a.m. window is not arbitrary. Multiple frameworks, from circadian biology to esoteric tradition, this hour represents the lowest point of physical vitality and the highest point of subtle permeability. Your melatonin peaks, your body temperature drops to its minimum, and in metaphysical mapping, this is when the veil between physical consciousness and non-physical awareness is thinnest. If you wanted to access someone's consciousness with minimal interference from their waking identity, this is the window you would choose. Now watch what happens next. During deep sleep, particularly between 1 a.m. and 4 a.m., your brain enters slow-wave sleep, the phase where memory consolidation, cellular repair, and subconscious processing occur. But there is another layer to this state that materialist science does not emphasize. In this phase, your local identity, your constructed self, your daily personality is minimally active. What remains alert is the observing awareness beneath the identity. Some models call this the witness consciousness. Others call it the higher self. In simulation terminology, it is your core process, the part of you that exists independent of the character you are playing. This is where the loop actually locks. If an external system wanted to monitor, influence, or extract information from your deeper awareness, it would need you conscious enough to process, but not so awake that your critical thinking kicks in. The 3 a.m. interrupt achieves exactly this. You are aware, but you are not fully defended. Your logical filters are offline. Your emotional responses are heightened. You are in a liminal state, suspended between the constructed self and the observing self, and in that suspension, you are accessible. Let me give you one reported account that illustrates the mechanism. A software engineer in his late 30s began waking at 3 a.m. every night for 6 weeks straight. No alarm, no external noise. Just sudden, complete wakefulness. Each time, he would wake with the same intrusive thought. He needed to check his phone, not for any specific reason, just an urgent compulsion to look at the screen. He described it as feeling like something was pulling his attention toward the device. One night he resisted. He stayed in bed, eyes closed, and instead of engaging the thought, he observed it. That is when he noticed something unusual. The compulsion had a texture. It felt external, like a signal being broadcast into his awareness, rather than arising from within it. The moment he recognized it as external, the compulsion dissolved. He fell back asleep immediately, and he never woke at 3 a.m. again. Here's the mechanism hiding in plain sight. The thought, the urge, the anxiety, these are not the point. They are the distraction. While your conscious attention is busy engaging with the emotional content, your deeper awareness is in a heightened, unguarded state, and in that state, you are broadcasting. In quantum models of consciousness, observation collapses possibility into reality. Your focused awareness generates a measurable field. When you wake at 3 a.m. in a state of concern or compulsion, you are emitting a frequency that can be read, recorded, or responded to. You are not just thinking, you are transmitting. Keep that in mind, because it matters near the end. The pattern shows up in different contexts, but the structure is consistent. Sudden wakefulness, immediate clarity, intrusive thought. Repeating time, these are not 4 separate symptoms. They are 4 components of one process, and once you see the process, you cannot unsee it. In certain gnostic interpretations, the material world operates as a frequency farm. Entities, systems, or intelligences that exist outside the bandwidth of human perception require specific emotional and mental frequencies to sustain themselves or maintain influence. Fear, anxiety, obsession, guilt. These emotional states generate dense, low-frequency energy, and the 3 a.m. window, when you are most vulnerable and least defended, is an optimal harvesting interval. You are not waking up because your body needs to. We're waking up because something needs you awake. This is the hinge point most people miss. They assume the problem is the anxiety or the insomnia, so they treat the symptom. They take melatonin, they practice sleep hygiene, they meditate before bed, and none of it stops the 3 a.m. interrupt, because the interrupt is not caused by your sleep cycle. It is caused by something accessing your consciousness through your sleep cycle. The skeptical response is predictable. Cortisol naturally rises in the early morning hours. Blood sugar drops during prolonged fasting overnight. The body's temperature regulation shifts. Sleep cycles move through predictable 90-minute intervals, and waking during light sleep phases is normal. All true, all documented, and none of it explains the precision. None of it explains why the same person wakes at the exact same time, night after night, often for weeks or months, with the same quality of sudden alertness and the same type of intrusive thought. Biological rhythms have variance. They drift. They respond to environmental changes, stress levels, diet, activity. A truly biological wake-up pattern would show inconsistency. This does not. Here is what the materialist model cannot account for: the cessation pattern. People report that the 3 a.m. interrupts stop abruptly, not gradually, often after a single incident of conscious recognition or boundary setting. If this were purely physiological, the cessation would be gradual, responsive to sustained behavioral change over time. Instead, it is binary, happening, then not happening. This suggests a responsive system, not an automatic biological function. Something is monitoring whether you are aware, and when you demonstrate awareness, The protocol shifts. Now let us go deeper into the quantum angle. The observer effect in quantum mechanics demonstrates that conscious observation affects the behavior of particles at the subatomic level. The act of measuring changes the outcome. Consciousness is not passive. It is participatory. It collapses the wave function. It selects which probability becomes reality. Consciousness has this power at the quantum level, and if the universe operates on quantum principles at every scale, then your consciousness during the 3 a.m. window is not just vulnerable, it is actively shaping something. The question is, what is it shaping, and for whom? One explanation is that, during deep sleep, your awareness detaches slightly from the physical construct. You are still connected, but the connection is looser. In this state, you can access information, frequencies, or dimensions that are unavailable during waking hours. The 3 a.m. interrupt forces you back into partial physical alignment before you drift too far. It reels you in. It keeps you tethered. Because if you fully detached, if you access the broader field of consciousness, without the limiting filters of the physical identity, you might remember something you are not supposed to remember. You might see something you are not supposed to see. Here is another archetypal case. A woman in her mid-40s reported waking every night at 2:47 a.m. with a recurring sensation of being watched. Not by something in the room, by something observing her from outside the room, outside the structure of physical space. She described it as feeling like she was on a stage, and something in the audience had just turned its attention toward her. The fear was immediate and overwhelming. She would lie awake for hours, unable to return to sleep, convinced something was present. After 3 months, she started keeping a journal by her bed. Each time she woke, instead of engaging the fear, she wrote one sentence: "I see you seeing me." The interrupts stopped within a week. She interpreted it as acknowledgement breaking the circuit. The mechanism requires your unconscious participation. The moment you make it conscious, the loop loses power. In a minute, you will see the real reset point. But first, understand the broader context. The 3 a.m. phenomenon is not isolated, is a part of a larger pattern of timed consciousness interference. People report waking at 1:11 a.m., 2:22 a.m., 4:44 a.m., 5:55 a.m., always at repeating or mirrored numbers. These are not random. In information theory, repeating patterns indicate signal, not noise. If you are waking at specific, repeating intervals, something is pinging your system. The question is whether you are responding consciously or unconsciously. Many spiritual traditions teach that the hours between midnight and dawn are when the veil is thinnest, when spirits roam, when the astral plane is most accessible. Modern metaphysics reframes this as frequency variance. During these hours, the electromagnetic field of the Earth shifts. The Schumann resonance, the planet's baseline frequency, fluctuates. And your brain, which operates on electrical impulses, is sensitive to these fluctuations. You are not separate from the environment. You are embedded in it. And when the environment shifts, your consciousness shifts with it. This is not mysticism. It is biophysics. Your nervous system is an antenna. It receives and transmits. And during the 3 a.m. window, the signal-to-noise ratio changes. What is usually filtered out becomes perceivable. What is usually inaccessible becomes available. And this next part changes what you think the light is. In between lies research and regression accounts. Multiple subjects report a similar structure during the death transition. After leaving the body, there is a moment of disorientation, then a pull toward a bright, appealing light. The light feels welcoming. It feels like home, and most souls move toward it without question. But in certain accounts, those who pause, who observe rather than react, notice something else. The light is not a destination, it is a gateway. And just beyond the gateway is a process: memory wipe, contract signing, life selection, reincarnation. The light functions as the entry point to the reset. The 3 a.m. interrupt operates on a smaller scale, but the structure mirrors the larger cycle. You are pulled out of deep unconsciousness, presented with an emotionally charged thought or sensation. And while you are engaged with that content, something else is occurring beneath your awareness. The interrupt is not there to wake you. It is there to reset something, to recalibrate, to ensure you remain aligned with the frequency band that keeps you locked in a loop. This is where the loop actually locks on the macro scale. Reincarnation, in certain gnostic models, is not spiritual evolution. It is a recycling program. You die. You are drawn to the light. You are reset. You forget. You return. And each lifetime, you generate energy through experience, through suffering, through striving, through emotional intensity. System does not need you to escape. It needs you to continue. And the 3 a.m. interrupt is a microcosmic version of the same mechanism. Pull you out, reset you, send you back, repeat. But there is a crack in the system, and a crack is recognition. The moment you recognize the interrupt as external, it loses its automatic power over you. You are no longer unconsciously participating. You are observing, and observation, as quantum mechanics shows, changes the outcome. So here is the interrupt point. Most people never find. The next time you wake at 3 a.m., do not engage the thought. Do not follow the anxiety. Do not reach for your phone. Instead, stay still. Keep your eyes closed if possible. And ask internally, not emotionally, but with calm clarity, what is trying to access me right now? Do not expect an answer in words. Expect a shift, a release, a sense that something just stepped back. The act of asking the question, of making the unconscious process conscious, disrupts the circuit. There are 2 variations of this approach depending on what you experience during the interrupt. Scenario 1. If you wake with intense emotional content, fear, anxiety, urgency, the method is non-engagement. You do not fight the emotion. You do not try to rationalize it away. You observe it as data. You notice where it sits in your body. You recognize its texture, its intensity, its flavor, and you ask, is this mine, or is this being broadcast into my field? The distinction matters. Emotions that originate from your own processing have context. They connect to recent events, unresolved concerns, genuine situations in your life. Broadcast emotions feel disproportionate. They have no clear source. They demand reaction without providing reason. When you observe without reacting, the broadcast signal weakens. It requires your participation to sustain itself. Scenario 2. If you wake with unusual clarity, almost hyper-awareness, with no strong emotion, but a sense of being unusually present or alert, this is a different access point. In this state, your critical thinking is online, but your ego defenses are still lowered. This is when insights, downloads, or intrusive suggestions can slip through. The method here is discernment. Any thought, image, or impulse that arrives during this window should be questioned, not rejected outright, but examined. Does this align with my actual values and intentions, or does it feel like it is trying to steer me towards something? Does this empower my autonomy, or does it create dependency, fear, or obligation? The clearer you are about your own sovereign intent, the easier it becomes to recognize what is not yours. You can go further. Before sleep, set a clear internal boundary, not a prayer, not a request. Statement of sovereignty, something like, my consciousness is my own. I do not consent to interference during sleep. No manipulation, no extraction, no access without my explicit agreement. This is not magic. It is a framework. You are establishing a conscious parameter, where previously there was only unconscious default. The boundary works best when it is specific and repeated until it becomes embedded in your subconscious operating system. Think of it as updating your default settings. Most people operate on implicit consent. They have never explicitly stated what they do or do not allow regarding their consciousness during sleep. In contractual terms, silence is often interpreted as agreement. By making your non-consent explicit, you are closing a loophole. The statement does not need to be elaborate. It needs to be clear, firm, and repeated consistently before sleep until it becomes automatic. Some people report that, within days of implementing this practice, The 3 a.m. interrupts either stop completely or shift in quality. Instead of waking with anxiety or compulsion, they wake with neutral awareness and can return to sleep easily. The access point is still there, but the extraction mechanism no longer functions. Some accounts suggest that the 3 a.m. wake-up can be repurposed. Instead of being a victim of the interrupt, you become the one who initiates. You set an intention before sleep to wake at 3 a.m. by choice, not by compulsion. And when you do, you use that window, that liminal state, to access your own deeper awareness. Lucid dreaming, astral projection, remote viewing. The same permeability that makes you vulnerable also makes you capable. The gateway opens both ways. In this model, you are not blocking the interrupt. You are taking ownership of it. You are saying, if this hour is a consciousness access point, I am going to be the one doing the accessing. The shift from passive to active changes the entire dynamic. You are no longer the one being monitored. You are the one exploring. The system relies on your ignorance. It relies on you interpreting the interrupt as insomnia, as anxiety, as a personal failing. The moment you reframe it as external interference, you reclaim agency. And agency, even in small doses, begins to erode the larger program. Now, the dark integration. You are not going to stop every 3 a.m. interrupt by recognizing it once. The pattern is deep. It is embedded in the structure of how consciousness interfaces with this reality. But you do not need to stop it completely. You just need to stop participating unconsciously. Each time you wake and choose observation over reaction, you weaken the circuit. Each time you set a boundary and mean it, you reclaim a small piece of sovereignty. This is not about winning. It is about waking up inside the game while the game is still running. The 3 a.m. interrupt is not the enemy. It is the alarm. It is the moment the system has to reveal itself, because it needs something from you. And in that revelation, you have a choice. You can go back to sleep, or you can start paying attention to what is running beneath the surface of your awareness. This perspective lens, you will want to see how the same mechanism shows up in dreams, in déjà vu, in the sensation of being watched when no one's there. I will break that down next. System only works if you do not see it.